Biden wants to implement a new 25% tax on the ultra-rich, and so we need to talk about what that is, whether it would actually work, and what Biden even hopes to accomplish with this new policy. As you can see here, Biden's billionaire tax takes aim at the super-rich, but can a wealth tax work in reality? Now, with a wealth tax, basically everyone has an opinion, but it is worth noting that approximately, according to this poll, 2/3 of voters say billionaires should pay a wealth tax. Now, around 2/3 of Americans say that they support a wealth tax on billionaires in an effort to close the wealth gap in the country, according to a new Hill Harris X poll. 67% of registered voters surveyed in the poll released Wednesday said billionaires should be targeted and have to pay a wealth tax to cut down on inequality, that's wealth inequality, with 33% actively opposing the effort. The survey found a majority of support for such tax among Democrats and independents, which kind of makes sense, at 85% and 66% respectively. The Republicans were more divided, with 53% saying that the ultra-rich should not be subjected to an additional tax, and 47% of Republicans were in favor of a wealth tax. The survey also found differences in opinion among those in different income groups, which kind of makes sense, with voters who earn more than $75,000 a year less in favor of taxing billionaires, 63%, compared to those that earn less than that amount, around 70%. And that kind of makes sense. If you are a Republican, probably you believe something more along the lines of either taxation is theft or the government is too large and too bloated anyway, so that it should be smaller and we should be taxed less so that private citizens can redistribute that wealth more evenly, because private companies are better at doing that than the government is. And it also makes more sense, if you are richer, you are probably more likely to see yourself as someone who could someday become a billionaire. So it absolutely makes sense that you would be less likely to support a tax like this. Now, I do just want to stop right here and say that this is a very politically divisive topic, and my objective here is to try and leave politics out of it as much as possible and only give you all of the facts that you are going to need to create a well-informed opinion coming out of this video. The first thing we have to talk about is, what is a wealth tax? A wealth tax is a tax imposed on individuals' net worth, or the market value of their total assets owned minus their liabilities. A wealth tax can be narrowly or widely defined, and depending on the definition of wealth, the base for wealth tax can vary. So this is a tax on the value of the assets or part of the assets that you have, and it's very different from something that most people pay, like an income tax. If you get a W-2, then you pay taxes based on the amount of money that you made in that calendar year. But a wealth tax, if it were implemented, would be a tax not on that, but on the value of everything you own. So if you owned a car and a house, maybe a boat, a second house, whatever you owned, that would be subject to a wealth tax. Now, assuming you were a billionaire, of course, this is not for people that aren't billionaires. Think of it more like a property tax. Every year you pay a tax based on the worth of your property, and you continue to pay that tax even if that property is not making you money. But that tax also goes up if that property appreciates in value. And herein lies the first issue, and we'll discuss more of the issues later, but it is, what would you tax? Would it be the absolute total net worth of everything you own, or would it just be like luxury goods like super yachts or mansions over $10 million or a fifth home or whatever else appears? And how would you tax things like artwork or historically significant items? Like if you have a signed guitar from Elvis Presley, you might consider that priceless, but how would an appraiser appraise that? Or if you have a huge piece of beautiful artwork, artwork is very subjective, and most people aren't willing to pay millions of dollars for artwork, but there are some collectors that are. How do you appraise and appropriately tax that? Now, while that would be difficult, it's not like it would be impossible, and there's actually precedent for this, as many other countries have implemented a wealth tax. The Global Revenue Statistics Database presents a roster of countries that have documented instances of revenue collected from wealth taxes. The data is limited to 65 to 2021. A total of 8 countries, Austria, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, were known to have collected revenue through a wealth tax in 1965. In ensuing decades, the number of countries reporting wealth tax revenue increased gradually and reached its peak in 1995, with 12 countries, Austria, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Switzerland, and Sweden, reporting revenue generated from some form of wealth taxation. So this has been done a dozen times previously, so it is definitely something that is very possible. It would not be easy, but to be fair, basically nothing around taxes or the economy is simple in the United States, so this would just be one extra layer of complexity that billionaires would have to deal with. So the wealth tax would be a tax on presumably the total net worth, or maybe the value of the luxury goods of any billionaires in the United States, and Biden wants it to be around 25% of their net worth. So the question is, would that actually work? And the answer is it's very complicated. The reason that Biden wants to tax the wealthy is because he recently submitted his 2025 budget proposal for the United States government. Biden's $7.3 trillion budget for the 2025 calls for taxing the rich and corporations to pay for Social Security and Medicare. See, Biden's proposal is up $400 billion from what it was last year. Last year was $6.9 billion, and this year it is $7.3 billion. And that extra money needs to come from somewhere. And so he's proposing that this extra money would come from taxing billionaires, what he calls, quote, their fair share, saying that they pay less in taxes than most other people in the United States relative to their wealth. He wants the welfare programs in the United States to be vastly expanded, and he wants the billionaires in the United States to be the ones that pay for it via this new tax. Now, as for will this will work, there are two main camps, obviously. Those who agree with it and think it'll work, and those who disagree with it and don't think it'll work. The people that agree with it and think that it would work and should be implemented have several arguments. These include, they say that the systems that allow billionaires to exist were set up by governments or enabled to be set up by the government, and as a result of the government putting in place those systems that allowed them to become billionaires in the first place, that they have an obligation to pay back into the system to help other people. There's also a belief that if you have a net worth of over $1 billion, you simply don't need that much money, and $10,000 or $20,000 to a billionaire is probably nothing. It's pocket change, but $10,000 or $20,000 to someone in poverty is an absolutely life-changing amount of money, and therefore billionaires should be giving the lower class that money. There's also an argument that billionaires made their billions off of the general population. Think about the Walton family owning Walmart. They're all billionaires, and they made their billions off of starting Walmart, which has low prices, and that primarily attracts low to middle class income people. If those are the people that made you rich, so the argument goes, then you owe it to them to pay back into the system and help them out. They helped you out and made you extraordinarily rich. Now it's your turn to help them out and redistribute some of the billions of dollars in wealth that you gained from them. Now, as for the arguments against, one of the bigger ones is that taxation is theft and any taxation is theft, but because that belief basically exists along a political line, I am going to ignore it for this video. The other main argument is that a wealth tax is simply too difficult to implement, and that the revenue generated from the wealth tax, one, would be less than Biden is estimating, and two, would not be worth the amount of effort that it would take to set up a system in order to actually tax that wealth, especially when billionaires will go as far out of their way as possible to try and legally hide as many assets as they can and pay less on this wealth tax. The second argument brought up against a wealth tax is a fear that billionaires will just up and leave the United States if you start taxing them, and if they leave, the huge amounts of money that they spend are no longer there to be spent. You can imagine that a billionaire living in a neighborhood would be really good for the local economy. They probably have lots of rich guests that come over. They go out to restaurants, they go out to bars, they go out, do things, have fun times, and spend lots of money, which is really good for a local economy. And if you start taxing that too much, so the argument goes, they're just going to leave and go to somewhere like Puerto Rico or somewhere overseas like Thailand or Vietnam that's not going to tax their wealth and is very happy to have their high spending habits. Now, as for my personal beliefs, I think Biden's heart is in the right place, but I think his head is just not. He basically wants to do two things. He wants to lessen income inequality in the United States, and he also wants to lower the federal deficit. But a wealth tax historically has not worked particularly well. Going back to this Wikipedia article that we looked at earlier on wealth tax, it says, although as of 2021, only 5 of the 36 countries continue to implement a wealth tax on individuals. Those 5 countries are Colombia, France, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. Even these very liberal, borderline socialist countries are no longer doing it, even though they had been doing it in the past, which means that there's something in the system that isn't adding up and working out such that the system is actually viable. If you want a wealth tax to actually work, you probably need most well-developed countries in the world to get together and decide that they are going to implement a universal wealth tax. That way, if Jeff Bezos decides he's being excessively taxed in the United States, he can't just go over to some other country and try and avoid the United States taxes and hold on to his billions. But if you want to reduce the deficit, you have to cut spending, and I don't think there's enough popular support in the government or in the general population to do that. And if you really want the rich to pay their fair share of taxes, then you have to rewrite the tax code so that there aren't so many big loopholes that they can exploit. The biggest and easiest loophole being that billionaires just take out bank loans against their net worth. They go to a bank and they say, I'd like $100 million to purchase a yacht, and if I can't pay it back, then you can take my Amazon stocks and sell those in order to pay back the debt. The banks are more than happy to give this loan because it's basically 100% guaranteed that they'll make the money back, so they give it at very low interest rates. And even though the total amount paid at interest would be very high because it's large amounts of money that billionaires are borrowing, it's still less than they would pay in capital gains tax and income tax should they sell stocks. Honestly, I do kind of think this is political posturing from Biden, because the real answer to stop people from dodging taxes is far more complicated than a one-size-fits-all law, and I think probably Biden knows that. Thanks for watching.